Hello everyone, welcome back to Talamh Bio TV, the Hedge School, Talamh Bio Hedge Schools. So today we're going to learn about CAP, and I have the great John Brennan is going to teach us from NOTS, who's the National Organic Training Skill Net. Is that right, John?
Yeah.
So
I think
John? How are you?
I'm great. I also should say my paid job is as manager of Leitrim Organic Farmers Co-op. So I'm chairman of NOTS. So I have a number of hats. Let's put it like that.
Exactly, yeah. So, but also very knowledgeable. I think when I wanted to learn a bit more about CAP, because I know a lot of Irish farmers know what CAP is, but they don't quite know how important it is, or maybe the people in Ireland don't either, because it's taxpayers' money after all. And it's the new one is the farm to fork. It's sort of a new strategy they're taking up. So if you would explain a bit about that, and I'll just share the screen for you here, John. Thanks.
Well, I suppose thanks, Breda. I mean, the CAP is an ongoing. I mean, we've had a number of the CAP generally runs for a 5 or 7 year term, and it sets out how agriculture basically operates within the EU and how agriculture is funded and what agriculture should deliver as well. And as part of this Keys CAP negotiations, we started off with this paper called the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal recognized that we need to do so much more environmentally, and food interacts. The production of food both impacts the environment and is impacted by the environment that it operates within. And so food is fairly fundamental to us all. And yet, when we start to look at where food fits in our budgets, in our daily lives, we find that a smaller and smaller percentage of our earned incomes go on food. When you went back a few generations, 40 to 50% of income, of your income went on food in a family situation. But more and more food has been dumbed down. And I suppose what we're trying to achieve under the Farm to Fork is to say, as part of this Green New Deal, we have a number of pillars that this Farm to Fork arrangement is built on. And so Farm to Fork indicates traceability all the way from the farm right up to the final producer. And you can have traceability of food that's very good and nutritious, and you can have traceability on food that's not nutritious, not particularly good. So in a way, Farm to Fork sort of spells out the pillars, certain pillars. And we have the graphic that's up there looks at things like sustainable food consumption, food loss and waste prevention, sustainable food production, and sustainable food processing and distribution. And all the time, we look at this and we say, in 3 of those pillars, we have the word sustainable. Yeah. So what is sustainable? The definition of sustainable? I had a very interesting discussion. I'm going to throw this in as an anecdote, where I was at a meeting in the EU, and there was a visiting professor from China, and I was talking to him about the issue of sustainability. And I said, Professor, what do you believe from a Chinese perspective sustainability to be in agriculture? And he just said quite bluntly, sustaining profits. So, and I kind of in a way admired his quick reaction. And so, there is also that view of sustainability. So I think that, we certainly need a more robust food production system than the ones we have, because we can see even now at a time of COVID, how quickly the supply chains can be interrupted. And we saw at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, people rushing out and bulk buying food and household items and all that, and how quickly we had white space on the shelf. So at a time when you have any kind of pandemic or other calamitous thing that could happen, if it was a climatic event, you could quite easily see how the central distribution model of food production would break down. So if we're really talking about sustainable food production, we have to ensure that individual countries have enough food to feed their people. And in the case of Ireland, we don't. I mean, yet we are a major food producing nation, and yet, within a couple of days, if there was a disruption in supply chains, we would be missing lots of staples, and lots of these are fruit and vegetables and basic commodities that we can grow here in Ireland. So I suppose that's one thing to look at. And food sovereignty, the things that Talamh Beo talk about, the ability of people to be able to eat appropriate food and have that available to them, in a localized way, I think is very important. The other side here is sustainable food consumption. So on the one side, you've got production, and then you're talking about sustainable food consumption. And, the way that we consume food now, how can we say that it's been consumed in a sustainable way? Because another part of this goes back to food processing and distribution. All of these are linked. So if the food processing and distribution part is unsustainable, then the food consumed can't be deemed to be sustainable. And so we get these kind of terms that the agri-business industry comes up with, such as sustainable intensification. And we hear the IFA talking about this, and we hear other organizations. And that sustainable intensification, it may be sustaining profits and incomes, but the collateral damage to the environment, to biodiversity, to rivers, to lakes, all sorts of things, that's not sustainable anymore. And the Environmental Protection Agency is telling farmers in Ireland that, what you're doing is damaging the environment. So the other thing then, of course, is food loss and waste. And of course, our centralized food systems that rely heavily on packaging, our supermarkets that rely on putting everything into tray packs and so on, very much lead to waste and loss, and not alone over packaging, but we're literally throwing out a third or more of all the food we're producing. And that is completely unsustainable. So, we're starting at a very low base with this. So whatever ambitions are in here, even if they're moderate ambitions, I think quite a bit can be achieved by doing a number of small things. And I think, what we really need at European level is to look at the CAP in its entirety, the CAP meaning the Common Agricultural Policy, who is benefiting from the CAP, and to try and have a fairer distribution. And when I say that, I talk about, in Ireland, small farmers, small producers, getting people who produce food locally for local markets, that being recognised as a public good. Because the ability for people to source their food locally is, I believe, a public good, because it's also a public good in that it shortens the supply chain, reduces packaging, reduces fuel, makes that food more sustainable. So I think there's an example of where we can have sustainable food production. From the point of view of sustainable food consumption and a fairness that's talked about under the farm to fork idea, then you have to have systems and outlets and methods of getting food to producers that give a fair price to the producer. And so in my time, I've encouraged lots of things, such as farmers selling directly, box schemes, involved in setting up of farmers markets, which, I'm delighted every week. I see the farmers who go into the market and benefit, and I see the other farmers that supply those markets, and I see how that's a nice short supply chain, leaving money, recycling money into the local economy. So if I look then at the food production model and the food consumption model, in those supply chains, there's much more fairness and there's a better return to the producer. The longer the supply chain, the more chance that there's a lower price paid to the producer. And while there may very well be traceability in a farm to fork idea, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is fair in that supply chain. So these are the kind of things that when we talk about sustainable food processing and distribution, another pillar. Well, if you have a product, highly processed product, with ingredients that are coming from all over the world, and indeed ingredients that may well be coming from Amazonia, which they're now saying that the Amazon is going to return to be a savanna. It's so far, the damage is so great that the Amazon may not exist in future as a jungle, or the way it is now as kind of one of the lungs of the planet. And I think that's extremely serious. And yet we are procuring food from areas like that and putting them into highly processed food that's highly damaging. So these are the things that I think that the CAP must address. And if they're not addressed, we continue on down the path of environmental degradation. And we have to think. I quote Professor Guy McPherson, who's probably sometimes quite controversial, but as he says himself these days, he's not on anybody's pay list. But he talks about, and that, the ability for humans to maintain their habitat. And this is what we're talking about now. We're talking about, when we talk about climate change, that humans exist and in a very, very narrow band of temperatures. Crops also operate in a very narrow band of temperatures. So for instance, a simple example is that if wheat, if suddenly in the spring you get a spike in temperatures and it goes over 30, 33 degrees, suddenly your wheat bolts and you lose your crop. So we're now in a situation where the impacts of climate change are starting to impinge on food production. And yet we have a growing population heading towards 9 billion. And so the ability for nations to wake up, and European nations as well as everybody else, and understand the choices that are made by us as humans, from people who produce food, people who consume it, and so on. Every action, as we know from the science, has an equal and opposite reaction. And so also, when we talk about all this sustainability, let's have a look at one example where this is definitely not practiced in Ireland, is the situation where we produce milk powder, and that is supplied all over the world. We are producing more and more food ingredients. So, we present ourselves as the green island selling butter and cheese and all this, when the bulk of what we're actually selling now, especially in dairy, is food ingredients. And when we think about this, we're producing milk, which is subsidized by Europe, which is exported to Africa. And that then is more or less dumped on those markets at world trade prices, putting the local African farmers out of business. So when we talk about fairness, we have to look at the externalities. We can't just simply look within the EU. We're saying exporting out of the EU, where you've got heavily subsidized food, how is that impacting on, peasant farmers? And we're talking here because the link into La Via Campesina, and that how is that impinging on the lives and livelihoods of small farmers in the country of destination for the cheap EU products? So there are a few of the things that come to mind as I'm looking at this graphic, as I'm thinking to myself. And so I suppose what we as Talamh Bio what we're really saying is that the current system is broken. But for a small number of people, the system being broken doesn't matter, because what you're doing is you're simply exhausting resources, damaging the environment, and still getting subsidized, and also getting money through the CAP, which is completely wrong. So there's a lot wrong with the current system. The consumers in Europe are very unhappy. They were very unhappy with the last CAP because they saw things like greening. So farmers were given money through something called greening, which really was nothing at all. It was just another, you had to have a 3-crop rotation. A 3-crop rotation is the basis of all arable systems. So that should have been kind of a given. So, there's now an attempt at the moment within this farm to fork to roll back, and to sort of, you have lobbyists in Europe who are there looking at the legislation and looking at the framework, and they're trying to unpick it so that they can maintain the business as usual paradigm. And I mean, so that really is a very, very retrograde step. And I think that, oftentimes, and I attended meetings this year in Europe. I listened to the Polish, the head of the president of the parliament, the head of the commission, talking about, his ambitions for farm to fork. I heard loads of voices in the room similar to my own. But really what happens is agribusiness gets in here and starts to unpick this. And this is what I'm trying to make people aware of, that you have huge amount of lobbies in Brussels, you know, and they're constantly there, well paid and everything. Most of the smaller farm organizations, you know, they go there, they do their bit, they try and lobby through either La Via Campesina, BirdLife, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and a lot of these are our colleagues out there. And when you sit in those rooms, you're looking at agribusiness across from you and all the environmental NGOs on the other side. It's very much like a war. And so what we've introduced into farming is more or less a war. It's a war on the environment, it's a war on soil, a war on water, ultimately a war on people. And I think that is something that we have to keep this in mind, that you know, we're involved in at a time where, you know, agribusiness is such a dominant paradigm in all of our food systems, and so many people are on the payroll that it kind of trundles along.
Yeah, and there's so many people, I suppose, citizens, food citizens, who aren't aware that the CAP, how badly distributed it is. And didn't
Yeah,
you say
I think
before,
so.
80%?
I think what happens sometimes, and you know, I'm an organic farmer. I've been involved in organic businesses for over 20 years. In Ireland, it's a tokenistic business. You know, we're there. We're kind of, there's a small amount that can be tolerated, rather than sort of saying, well, hold on, Ireland actually could provide the model for sustainability at European level. And we're a laggard in just about every other. If you take any environmental metric, apart from the fact maybe that we ban plastic bags, you know, our record is pretty abysmal. And yet, you know, we have everything going for us to actually change that around. I mean, give you one example. This week, we find out from a leading agricultural consultant that we have one variety of potato left, Rooster, but we have to get all the seed from Scotland. And now we're going into a no-deal Brexit situation. So what kind of tariffs are going to be on that? Like, this is the basis of, like, so we don't have the seed. There was a time when up here in the local village of Knockcrockery, when my father used to work there, we used to produce certified seed for export to places like Cyprus and so on. Like, what happened that? What really happened all of that is that agribusiness started to sort of, you know, come in on that, and suddenly you get to a stage where one or two companies produce all the seed, and then they're the dominant force. And then, so that is disenfranchising. It goes against the tenets of food sovereignty. It also means that there's no food security. So I think that there's an awful lot wrong within our system, within our food systems. Can they be corrected? Of course they can. They can be corrected where there's proper governance, proper legislation, and an environment that sort of sees where we're going over the edge in terms of nobody now can deny that we are in. It's not about climate change anymore. It's irreversible. For the most part, irreversible and dramatic climate change. And I think that is going to put pressure on plants, animals, systems, and so on, especially when we have to feed so many people. So I think that we have somehow to use the farm to fork strategy to build much more resilient into our food systems. We need to look at the diversity of plants and animals that we have. I myself am involved in rare breeds. I do that partly because I believe the conservation of the genetics of rare breeds are very, very important. I think other people are doing it with plants. You know, this week we were glad to be able to help the food sovereignty people or seed sovereignty people. Again, Wayne Frankham and people down on Seed Savers as well, because they're doing invaluable work. Because ultimately, we need to look at plants and animals that have evolved in our environment over millennia, and that have evolved and have been around even where there has been a shift in climate. We've had shifts before around the time of the Vikings and so on. So I think, you know, this is the type of thing that should, but mostly what's going on is, we're still in this sort of thing about, we can produce it intensively, we can master the environment, and, we can produce, through sustainable intensification, good food. And I don't believe that, and I think an awful lot of consumers don't believe that.
And well, I think so too, because it's highlighted, COVID has highlighted a lot of things, like, I mean, we even run out of flour, and the fact that we import so much flour from England. And I mean, when Brexit comes, it could really highlight even more how much we do import. And maybe the conversation starts to get going, because I really think food citizens are just not engaging with it. Like in terms of CAP, like people don't realize that it is the Irish government. I mean, CAP is a European thing, but it does fall on the government at the end of the day to distribute CAP. I'm right about that?
Yeah, and also the big problem is that member states will have quite a lot of leeway how they will be given the broad outline of what but the individual member states then can transpose those into their own for their own country. And this is also a danger, is that Ireland has tended in the past to go for the lowest common denominator in terms of so what it has done is it has sort of marginalized organic farming pretty well. Our people that are involved, environmentalists, are all, woolly and sandal wearing and all this kind of nonsense, So, and also what we have in Ireland, and there's no point saying it, is we have an old boys club, mainly boys, I have to say, and they're all stacked up in all the usual places, and they all talk to each other. And they are the ones that I feel, they need to kind of look at themselves and say, what are we going to actually leave in terms of do we really want an island where the green is basically algae in every lake, in every river, every well polluted? And these are like people who say, well, have you proof of it? Every day of the week, I talk to people.
Yeah.
I talk to even farmers who recognize the damage that's been done.
40 shades of synthetic green.
Indeed. So I think, but there are negatives in there, but I do think that, people need to sort of wise up. The other thing that's coming down the track, and this is an important one, nutrient density of food is something that people are not aware of. For instance, a lot of the food people are eating nowadays is only a fraction nutritionally dense in terms of what was available 50, 60 years ago, or especially before the Green Revolution. We now have technology coming down that you will be able to go into a shop or supermarket and you will be able to maybe point a spectrometer at an apple or that, and it will give you a reading on the nutrient density of the food. I think when that happens, people are going to realize very quickly that what they're eating is pretty well. It might be better in some cases for somebody to eat a piece of cardboard rather than maybe some of the apples on the shelves. The nutritional quantities in that would be so minimal. And I mean, yourself, you go home and take an apple off your tree, you eat it, it's juicy. And then the next day you go into a shop, you see the same green apple, you bite into it, it breaks off. It's not like eating an apple. But the thing is, if you have no experience of eating that really rich, juicy apple, you think that's the norm. Yeah. And so what has happened is that people don't really know what chicken tastes like anymore because they're eating industrial product. So you're on this industrial product where they add in flavorings and so on, and they're the kind of things that kind of keep you hooked, the sugars and all of the other things. So the real flavors and so on that we all enjoyed, and I think through the eating of good quality organic food, we can continue to enjoy again and again and again. I think that's something that's lost on people. Also, they're not the macronutrients, the micronutrients in food as well, the zincs and all the things. I mean, I'm sitting here over a health food store, and more people are coming in looking for magnesium supplementation, potassium supplementation. All the things that you would ordinarily have got from food now have to come via supplements. And people need to supplement because they suffer from a range of different conditions as a result of not having proper nutrition. And that nutrition only comes from food that's produced in a way that gets all of those things from the soil. And that just doesn't happen very often anymore.
Yeah, that technology could be a game changer, all right. It could, the old phrase, pay the farmer to keep you healthy. People,
Yeah,
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 say
yeah.
pay the
But
doctor, because yeah, your nutrients, so it's obviously, I think a lot of us, apparently every single one of us are deficient in magnesium because it's deficient in
yeah,
the soil. And even
yeah,
doing the green cert now, learning a bit about what minerals you should be in the ground, but like even they have to spray the land with boron, which seems to me,
yeah, that's
how
right.
how are we deficient in boron in our soils? That sounds kind of serious
Mm.
to me without even being
I,
a scientist.
because I think the work that Knott's is doing on regenerative and biological farming starts to look beyond the chemical analysis
Yeah,
of farming. So for the last, whatever, 60, 70 years, we've been talking about putting out chemicals to grow grass and then developing um, particular strains of grass and plants that work with those chemicals, rather than sort of seeing what the plant can do for itself. So what plants can do is really amazing. Plants can put down really deep roots, and those roots can then extract the minerals in that even from, pretty poor subsoil. They can improve the soil, and as well as that too, if we have legumes, we can take nitrogen from the air. So, you know, with the correct mix of plants, with diversity in swards and diversity in plants themselves, we can do an awful lot more. And we only have to look across the water to. I was very interested the other night, Prince William, who could someday be king. But, and he would have got it from his father, Prince Charles, but his knowledge and his understanding of, all of the interactions, things I've talked about now, that kind of leadership that he's starting to exhibit now, saying, look, things are in a calamitous state when we have to take action. But you don't hear that from any politicians here. I mean, we have the Green Party in government now, and it's great, but and certainly members of the Green Party are speaking this language. But by and large, this is kind of considered to be woolly, sort of backward kind of discourse. Sure, and that's what you're up against, and
yeah,
that and
yeah.
that is and that kind of analysis suits the industry, suits all the people that are feeding into this, because we have to remember that it's really, about much more about agribusiness now than agriculture. We're trying to get back again to agriculture, but really agribusiness has hijacked the ship.
But just wasn't the cap, didn't it include something to do with they're trying to come to 25% organic land? Is that just
Well, yeah, I mean, the ambition in the CAP is to have 25% of utilizable agricultural area in Europe converted to organics. And of course, some countries have done fantastically well and continue to do. Countries like Austria, countries like even Austria, Germany, even countries in Eastern Europe. In fact, Ireland is nearly at the bottom of the pile, yet we're longer in the EU than anybody else.
yeah, what is the percentage, John? Do you know?
Sorry?
What is the percentage of organic land in Ireland?
It's less than 2%. Less than 2%. So I mean that, and and even to get to 2%, I mean, I remember there was an ambition way back when Trevor Sargent was junior minister for agriculture in the last Green Party. There was an ambition for 5%, which of course I knew would never be realised. So I suppose the other thing is that in many parts of Europe, the Green vote is much stronger. Green Party has done very well in France and Germany in recent years, so they are much more influential in government. Basically, we're not green country. We're green in terms of, yes, we have green grass and all of that. And, when I sit out there in Europe, I hear these voices from other across the room, some of them Irish, saying, sure, we're a green country and sure, isn't it great? And the sun is shining. This kind of like a kind of a rubbish analysis, which is almost insulting. It's insulting to me, but I have people looking around at me and saying, who are these people? So I think there's certainly a change. I also see the other changes I see is in eating patterns as well. I mean, we produce a lot of livestock in Ireland and we do it very well. But we have probably, if we look at millennials and maybe Generation Z, many of these people have already made the decision that industrial farming of animals is something they want no part of. And this is going to provide big challenges, because even as organic farmers, we talk about the role of animals, and that in recycling and nutrients and everything. So we may very well have like those particular segments have made decisions. Now, it may turn out that the food that they eat is not great either, but they've made the decisions, well, we're not going to inflict pain on any animals. And that's their thinking. Animal farming, bad, end of story. That lumps everybody into the same situation, whether you're an organic farmer or an intensive farmer. And I think there are lots of challenges, but I do think that countries need to strip it back. They need to strip it back to saying, like, what kind of country do we want? What kind of environment do we want? What kind of food systems do we want? Should food be all sold in 2 supermarkets? There needs to be those kind of questions in terms of, so I would say you have to be able to reimagine the food system. And if you're talking about from farm to fork, that you shorten up the food supply chains. Of course, there'll always be a need to import citrus and other things. But we should, as a country, the staples that we need, there should be a situation where there's a strategy that says, no, we're going to be self-sufficient in fruit and veg. We're going to have a more diverse agriculture. It's not about specialization anymore. We have all the dairy in County Cork, and we do all the nice environmental stuff over in the west of Ireland. That's the way things are being pushed. So what's happening is environmental schemes are going west, and intensification continues on. As long as we don't upset that, we can still rip out the odd hedge, and sure, if there's a penalty, what about it, and so on. So it's a mindset. It's going to need to change rapidly, because time is short, and we really are looking at the mess that we've created. And the CAP is one mechanism for doing it, but not the only mechanism. What it really needs is leadership, and there are some signs of that coming.
Yeah.
But I don't see any of it coming from a lot of the major farming organisations, and I think that's why Tábhacht Beo has to be a voice. For an alternative voice that says, hold on, this cannot continue. There are other ways, there are other systems and other methods where we can produce good quality food for everybody. Everybody can enjoy it, everybody can be healthy. Imagine if everybody had access to really good, healthy food. We could simply take all the pressure off the health system. We have a creaking health system. All we're worried about at the moment is, we need to have level 5. Let's get level 5 in. And the main reason for this is that if you end up with a spike in COVID, in Sweden they can cope because they've got good, and Denmark with good health system. Here, the whole system creaks and falls over. And so the other way of doing it is for people to eat healthy food, so that the chronic diseases that they're all, weighing down the health service with. So let's imagine that there was more vitamin D available in food. Everybody now knows the link between vitamin D and COVID. So if you're not deficient in these things, we're not deficient in magnesium, calcium, we have better bones. I mean, let's look at osteoarthritis. Let's look at osteoporosis. The rise in these things is just phenomenal. So let's just cop on, for God's sake. Everybody knows that generations ago, we didn't have shops full of supplements and medicine, all this. The medicine came through the food.
Yeah.
That was it, simply.
Thanks very much, John. That was great, because I think getting the conversation going is big. And even that little thing about the potato, the fact there's one variety left, I mean, that's something as Irish people, that's like a hook you can nearly get into over the next 2 years. It's going to become really important as we come into 100 years of land and all that sort of thing in Ireland, So
I haven't gone into the kind of various mechanisms under CAP that can help. There are supports for organic farming, sure. There are supports. Hopefully, there will be supports for agroforestry, and there'll be supports for lots of other things, farming for nature, all of this. But compared to the supports that there's there for the business as usual, intensive, damaging type farming, it's still very, very small, and that needs to change.
80-20, isn't it? Like 80% of the money is going to 20% of the farm.
Yeah, the 80-20 rule, absolutely. And then there are farmers who are armchair farmers, people who they're just landowners. You know,
Yeah.
there's a whole I mean, there's always a certain amount of fraud as well. You know, because the systems are not, you know, they're not watertight. But I mean, you know, I've gone to farmers meetings in Ireland because I'm also an agricultural advisor, and I basically hear big farmers who are on 80 and 100,000 euros from the cap telling the IFA, it's your job to make sure we don't lose any of that money. We don't want any of that money going to small farmers, to other farmers, to organic farmers. It's a case of what we have, we hold, and you'll hold it for us, and you'll go out there to Europe and battle for it. And that's really it. And there's no talk about, you know, you hear them disparaging comments towards the Greens. Oh, they're going to let wolves out all over the place and we'll have to hide in trees. This sort of kind of mad analysis.
Scapegoat.
But
It's deflection. You know,
it is.
you know, you never hear a good debate about CAP, but I'm still waiting to hear it on the radio and television. It just seems to, you know, just that's why I was so interested to talk to you about, learn more about it. There's always more to learn about it. I mean, you can dig deep into it. And Lavina Campesina have a good, if you want to look at their website, Lavina Campesina have a good detailed CAP as well.
One of the things that, one ambition in the next CAP, and I hope it's realised, is that for instance, if money is paid to farmers for public goods, whether that it's measurable, so that you have what you have is you basically set baseline. So for a habitat or whatever it is, and you say, right, there has to be a continuous improvement over a period of 5 years, or else you don't get paid. So it's results based. We need results based. That this idea of paying money to farmers and saying, sure, you're doing greening or you're doing this, unless there's a tangible way, or by doing baseline studies and saying, right, there's an improvement or disimprovement in these habitats. And if they're disimproved, in actual fact, I have absolutely, you know, give them the money, take the money away again, you know, or else, you know, have methods of penalties. And I as well think that, you know, for instance, the whole issues around, and I say it here, is things like, for instance, this whole business with Ireland looking for derogations so that they farm can produce more than 170 kilograms of nitrogen. That has to stop. And we actually have to say to farmers, no, and I can tell you that a lot of the so-called systems where you export nutrients from one farm to another, that's just fakery. It happens on paper, but it never actually leaves. So there's a lot of what I would call low-level sort of, you know, activity, which is bordering on criminal, you know, and is part of those mechanisms that are left in place. If those mechanisms, there are derogations and things like that, for instance, Ireland or even Kilcha continues to look for derogations for aerial spraying, you know, of chemicals in places like Wicklow, and they still get them. So the EU, as well as and the CAP, as well as having potential to do an awful lot of good, is still maintaining systems that are inappropriate, damaging, and they need to change radically. I think as well that consumers as well hopefully would start to look at food in a different way, that they'll start again to, and I know this always comes back and people say, well, people don't have money and they can't afford it. But I see people who can buy a new car for 30,000 and they still buy cheap food. It's about education.
It's about education, because I mean, take care of your wellness now, or you'll be taking care of your illness later. It's, you know, money is.
No, I mean, every Thursday, I usually on a Thursday morning, I'm in the local farmers market, or, you know, helping to set up, and I see people who come in on very modest incomes, and they spend money on good food because they understand the link. It's not because they're well off or anything else like that. Some are not. So I think that this is very much about education, and I think our system needs to have a way again of introducing nutrition and food as a curriculum item, right all the way through from kindergarten right on.
Yeah, I think that it is in the educational system, but I feel like what I found, like when I'm here in well, I'm in Ballinasloe, we do have beach lawn. There is access to good food there, but there's some places that don't have farm shops, and so it's not in like good food isn't celebrated in supermarkets. I
Mhm.
mean, it's really, God, you'd be hard pressed to find an organic apple in
Yeah,
Tesco.
yeah.
And that's
I mean,
wrong.
I think of models like, I mean, Porrick and Una and the family there in Beach Lawn. It's fantastic to have that as a resource locally. The same way with the likes of Green Earth. We were talking about Galway 2020, so I reference Galway farms that I know,
Yeah.
and you know, also other places just south of there, then like the urban co-op that nurture smaller producers, and and they have a growing number of people because the urban co-op's growing dramatically fast.
Yeah, great.
So we do have a cohort of people who understand the food systems much better than we think. It's still a very small section of the population, but I think it will continue to grow. And I think that the type of, if you're not producing the type of food people, consumers like that want to consume, that then should some way act as a catalyst for change. But also you do have to legislate as well. And I think that
Exactly. You have to, it doesn't help when you have a former Minister of Agriculture saying in the Dáil that, basically that who can afford organic food, he says. A man on 80 grand a year, or
of
whatever.
course,
Ridiculous stuff.
but
It's ridiculous.
but that's playing to the masses, you see.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the same old mantras, that
No,
that that that, that you're, and it's and of course, ignorant comment is one that's, it's easy to throw those things out and then people are sure nod, and and everybody goes home. But I really feel that we have spent the last 30 years working really hard to make sure that any move towards true sustainability in terms of fostering a culture around the development of the organic sector and other similar systems, especially ones that looked after the environment. I mean, we've, from the 1980s onwards, we spent most of our time taking out hedgerows. We were very busy all through the 80s and then right through the 90s and right up to date, saying we have to make fields bigger. It was about production, it was about getting, we weren't producing enough food, more nutrients, more fertilizers, more chemicals, and so on. And and that mindset is in a generation, and they're not able to unpick that in their brain. And so what we see is that the organic sector is inhabited by lots of people who maybe came from other disciplines or were away and then came back and took over farms and so on. And so they were exposed to a different set of maybe conditions wherever they were. But I really think that, if we don't address the issues around, what I would call non-sustainable farming very, very quickly, well then, and you see at the moment, if you pick up any farming newspaper, the Farmers Journal or the Farming Independent, the next thing you see another guy who's straight out of UCD who's milking 500 cows some other place. And they're held up as the poster boys. And the next thing you see the ad for the bank and all the other things. So that's really what it's about. That guy on that 500 cows, he is keeping a whole bunch of people going. And that is, and I'm not saying that with other types, I mean, there's always need for some inputs. There's always need for, for trade and all that. We're not talking about that. What we're simply talking about, we have moved from family farms to what's now described as dairy platforms. They have nothing to do with, you have a dairy platform milking 300-400 cows, you put in a manager, and that's what it's about. There's no talk about anything else except production.
And just in terms of we'll just finish up on the cap. How can, should the citizens who are interested in, things like pollution, environmentalists, that, really it all affects, like even that the groundwater in Cork now, some of it's polluted. I mean, this is getting serious. Should they lobby the government, write to their local TDs? Because the cap is still being negotiated at the moment, isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I think they should ask questions of their MEPs, their TDs, engage as much as they can through social media. But I also think that they should start making some choices.
Yeah.
They themselves can change things by saying, well, I'm going to really, work to try and find maybe a local producer. More and more, even livestock farmers are trying to, they're going to a butcher, getting their animals butchered and trying to sell those directly. If you buy that from the farmer, you're putting the money directly back into his pocket and the local butcher. So if we decide to support by our actions more local food, more local supply chains, smaller growers, smaller producers, then I think that is the first thing we can do. I think then other things that, as I say, I think if you're involved in a, grow your own or some kind of local group, or if you're involved in a local environmental group as well, I mean, we have lots of challenges out there. I mean, in Leitrim, the county that I work in, we have fracking. People got together around that, they lobbied, and they stopped that happening. And so that was just one thing.
Crack off.
So those environmental kind of groupings are often discussing other items as well. They're things that you can kind of coalesce around. I think as well, we do have markets, we do have other things as well. But I just think that, but of course, there's always going to be, and I'm not saying that, supermarkets that don't have a part to play, but they also have to start they also, if they really want to contribute to this, they need to start to reshape things as well. They need to start scrutinize their own systems, their own waste, how they can actually reduce waste. And we have seen examples like in the UK where Waitrose is bringing in somebody to greatly look at how they can reduce waste through packaging and so on. So, it's a multi-layered, multifaceted approach. One thing I do think is that the idea of capping payments from Europe to 50,000 per farm, that's absolutely sacrosanct. We have to stop this thing of somebody like, Mr. Larry Goodman getting 250 or 250,000 out of the cap. And while some small farm
proposed by our new minister, isn't that right?
it is, and I welcome that. I welcome Mr. McConnell proposing that. But also, I think that smaller farmers who are delivering on, they should have some form of basic income as well, or even a basic income supplement, or a situation where until they can get their production levels up to a certain, because nobody should expect to starve. But the way that the thing is structured at the moment, the smaller producers are being ignored by the Department of Agriculture and being ignored by Europe. But especially here in Ireland, the systems are set up that the small producer basically gets nothing out of the cap. And the cap was specifically designed and I remember when Dacian Cholos was the commissioner, he talked about the 3 million small farmers in Romania and the need to preserve these because they're delivering so much more. They're keeping communities together. They're keeping services, they're doing so much more in terms of keeping the countryside open. And so, I see it in County Leitrim, where the loss of farmers from the land, and that results in, over reforestation in certain townlands, and, basically a loss of culture because
farming is more, you lose farmers, you lose rural life, you lose the anthropological web, I mean, it's very serious. But thanks, John. We'll finish up there because we've had a great conversation. But hopefully, on the day when people are listening, we can get more people with CAP because it's a real. It's going to be like once CAP's put in, it's 7 years, isn't that right? It's a really long haul. Like
it is, but I think it's also a very long haul if we get it wrong. Yes. Because every 7 years we're told that in order for us to sustain ourselves on the planet, we have a very short window. It's not just Greta Thunberg, but the scientists are saying we have to act on a planetary basis and with haste. And so this requires moving beyond governments it requires a global movement to say that the current paradigm, the current capitalist model that's based upon the gouging of resources and the unsustainable ways in which we live could lead to our extinction. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, because you mentioned that sustainable is on 3 of the 4 pies. And
Mm.
sustainable is almost been like the word organic. It's somehow been sort of
Yes,
taken,
it's a word that doesn't really,
doesn't
it's
it?
there, but it's far too broad, because that's like I pointed out at the start. You could be talking about sustaining profits, and sustain. So what are we trying to
What are we
sustain?
trying to sustain?
The thing ultimately we need to sustain is ourselves as a species and the health of our species. And unless we have a framework in which that can happen, we'll say in a, how would I call it? I won't use the word sustainable, but if that can't happen in a way that's ecologically sound, that respects environment, that is sort of basically part that basically enhances the whole fabric of the biosphere, well, then we're on the road
Yes,
to nowhere.
because really regenerating is better than sustainable, because as someone, Kevin Dudley, or one of our other Talamh Bio members said, there's not much left to sustain.
Yeah,
If
and I think for farmers who are listening to this out there, we have BioFarm 2019
yes,
coming up, where we have and again, the beauty of what we're doing here, Breda, and is that these conversations now can be had globally, and that through technology. And I think technology has provided us with many solutions. I mentioned as well this idea of the spectrometer to work out the nutrient density of food. I think that could be a real game changer. I can imagine the food industry will do what they can legally, some aspects to stop that happening. But I want to see a time when I go in with the phone, I point it to the food, and it either says it's good or it's rubbish. And thank you very much for this evening's interview. It's been always good having these discussions, because not oftentimes you get a chance. You just have to have slightly duller discussions. Not this
you're
evening.
full of knowledge anyway, John. I quite enjoy. You should have your own little channel, but we'll interview again. This is the start of it.
Okay.
Thanks, John. And good
Yep. Thank you, Rita. Good night.